This is the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria, session number 33.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Hey everybody, welcome to session 33 of the Behavioral Observations Podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Britain Behavioral Consulting. That is the independent fieldwork supervision service of one Dr. Lisa Britton. That's Britton, not Britain like the country. Lisa provides quality supervision, particularly in a distance context. And if you want to learn more about her background and what she does, you can go check out session 29 of the podcast, where she talks about best practices in supervision and kind of gives a background on her career and her perspective on doing this type of work. And I know a lot of you are already reaching out to Lisa. Some BCBAs are reaching out to her to get some mentorship and guidance as it relates to both supervision and general practice issues. So I want to thank you guys who have reached out to Lisa, supporting our sponsors here. Certainly supports the work we do at the podcast and helps deliver this type of content. So again, if you are interested in reaching out, you can go to BrittonBehavioralConsulting.com /contact and fill out the information there, and that'll put you in touch with Lisa, and you can go from there. So as far as today's episode is concerned, today is a very different episode. And a few weeks ago, I was contacted by folks from the ABA study group. Now, if you're not familiar with the ABA study group, it's a Facebook group that was put together to help students learn applied behavior analysis, and certainly folks who have been practitioners for some period of time, continue to be acquainted with some of the terms and things like that we might not use in everyday practice. So two people in particular reached out to me, Roger Matar and Celia Heyman, and I was a member of, or am a member of, the ABA study group Facebook group. And, I would see posts here and there and things like that, but I didn't really know exactly what they did until they reached out to me. I had a chance to talk to these guys for a little while and get a really good idea about kind of what they've been about and the yeoman's work that they do in terms of supporting people who want to learn about behavior analysis. So they have these Zoom sessions very frequently where they go over things like ethics and, the basic principles, and they've got practice questions and things like that. So if you are on the Facebook, you can search for ABA Study Group and ask to join the group and find out more about what they are about. But I think it's the work that they do is just great. And so anyway, they reached out to me, and I found myself in kind of an awkward situation. They wanted to interview me and ask me questions about the podcast and things like that. And so that was, like I said, they kind of turned the tables, if you will. And what I found out about going through this process is that I have a renewed respect for all the people I've interviewed thus far. By that I mean that it's one thing to ask the questions; it's a totally different thing to answer them. And listening back to some of the answers I gave to some of the questions, I'm kind of wishing I had some do-overs here and there. But maybe that's just me being a little, self-critical or whatever. But it occurred to me too that it might be a good idea for those of you who are in the job hunting phase of your career to practice doing some interviews with peers, so you have some answers and you're comfortable answering questions off the top of your head and things like that. I know I probably could have used a little bit of practice before this interview, but it was fun. They basically asked me questions about the story behind the development of the podcast, why I created it and things like that. They asked me about my background in behavior analysis and things like that. And so they asked me a lot of questions that I typically ask guests and things like that. So it was kind of fun to kind of think about that from the answering perspective and not the asking one. And then it is a Zoom meeting. If for those of you who aren't sure what that's all about, basically it's an online video meeting with multiple attendees, and so participants were able to ask questions either in the chat or they could ask them directly. We even had kind of a hot mic moment. What I mean by that is that I'm thinking that someone's mic was unmuted and someone came in and made some not so charitable comments about our Zoom call. So, I'm going to cut that out and put it at the very end of the podcast. So if you want to hear kind of like the blooper, then you can stay through to the entire length of the show and put that at the end. There is an expletive in there, so if you're driving with little ones, you can tell them to cover their ears. You can turn the radio down. You can do whatever precautionary measures you wish to take. And so without any further ado, please enjoy this conversation between me and Roger and the rest of the ABA study group.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now, here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Hello, everyone. This actually is not Matt Sikoria. This is Roger Matar with ABA Study Group. But we do have Matt Sikoria here with us, joined live in the studio. And I just want everyone to know that this is, once again, a live recording. So if you do hear any background noise, that should be a great thing, because that means people are here listening and engaged. So, Matt, how are you?
I'm doing great. I am so excited to be here. Thank you guys so much for inviting me. This is really a privilege. I'm wicked psyched.
It's great to have you. It really is. We've been Zooming with ABA Study Group for a while now, and to have you on the show is really amazing, and we're going to be excited to ask you some questions for once.
Oh, man, I'm ready.
Oh, man. All right, so let's hop right into it and ask you if you can tell us what got you into behavior analysis.
All right. Well, this may take the entire episode. Try to give the Reader's Digest version, but all right. So I was always interested in psychology, and I took a psych class in high school, decided to be a psych major in college. I went to the University of New Hampshire, and at the time, it was kind of an eclectic department. I was interested in things like memory, and what we might refer to colloquially as cognitive processes or thoughts, feelings, etc. And thought I was really going to get into studying cognitive psychology and to a lesser extent personality and social psychology a lot. That's what my early psych classes were about, and I really dug the cognitive psychology model. Just in terms of how their thinking of how memory works and things like that. And I thought, okay, well, in order to pursue this, I'm going to need to get some sort of PhD and go through an academic track and things like that. And so I decided to start taking the more science or rather than kind of counseling oriented track, if you will, in our program. And so one of those courses was this course called Behavior Analysis and Its Applications. And I read the first book for that class was Dick Malot's Principles of Behavior. I have it around here somewhere. The Elementary Principles of Behavior. It was the second edition, so this is kind of when dinosaurs roamed the earth. This was back in the mid 90s, early 90s rather. When I started reading the book gave all these examples of people having what looked like, real jobs with psychology. I didn't know enough to call it behavior analysis at the time. And I thought, wow, this is really cool. This actually showed kind of like a career path that one could follow that didn't necessarily required an academic type of occupational track, if you will. And then the material kind of spoke to me as well. It seemed very concise. Obvious. I didn't really know what parsimony was at the time, but looking back, I think that's what appealed to me. I'm like, this is very simple. I can do this. I think I can get this. This is not way up here in this kind of, ether. And I really got into it. The next course of the next behavior analytic course was behavior modification, and it was taught by a guy named Tony Nevin, or as is known in the literature as John A. Nevin, the guy who developed the whole behavioral momentum theory and things like that. So we're talking like a really, dyed-in-the-wool experimental psychologist from like the old days, really contemporaries with a lot of those people at Harvard back in the day, and was an early EAB guy. And so I started talking to him and got more and more interested in it, in behavior analysis. And he offered me a job in his lab, working with one of his graduate students, a guy by the name of Randy Grace, and who is also pretty well represented in the kind of JAB literature.
Wow.
And so I worked with Randy in his lab for a while, not doing anything glamorous, mind you. It was mainly just moving pigeons from like the cage into the operant chamber and hitting enter on a computer. But it was for me very exciting because I was like actually, closer to the scientific process. It was super cool. So I really enjoyed that. I got a chance to take a class from William Baum, who did all the research on, the variations of the matching law and stuff like that. And so I got some real kind of classic exposure to some, early EAB scientists. Still thinking I wanted more of an applied, career path, though. Ended up applying to a couple different graduate programs. Ended up going to Auburn University, and studied with Jim Johnston there. I got to work in his dog lab. We did, contracted research on the olfactory capabilities of dogs, how well they could detect things like TNT or cocaine and smokeless powder and plastic explosives and heroin and stuff like that. So we had all these drugs and explosives. It was total pre 9/11, right? So I can only imagine what the security around that stuff is these days. And so that's kind of how I got into behavior analysis. That was a PhD program I was in, and just family circumstances led to me leaving that early. The jobs at the time that were available were working with individuals with developmental disabilities. Again, this was a while back. I didn't know enough to call it autism, but many of the kids and adults that we worked with had varying types of developmental disabilities, some of them being autism. And I applied to a couple different places, ended up working at a company called AdvoServe. And the CEO at the time, Judy Fable, said she hired me because I work with animals. In other words, she felt confident that I knew the kind of basic behavioral, concepts and principles and things like that. So
yeah, well, I was going to say, it sounds so far like a lot of the early career was working with animals.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yes, it was.
And did you feel like those skills generalized easily when you moved over to developmental disabilities?
I think so. I mean, certainly, not only just the skills, but also the classes we took at Auburn. The classes we took at Auburn were, funny enough, Jim didn't teach at all the whole time I was there, because the contracts the research contracts he was in charge of kind of bought out his teaching position so he can manage the implementation of these research contracts full time. But I was fortunate enough to take classes from really, really smart folks, like guys like Chris Newland, Tom Critchfield, and others. And so we had these great courses. We had this course called The Contextual Control of Behavior. It was all about, stimulus control. And we had a class called Reinforcement and Punishment. and looked at all the basic literature on reading Honig and Staden, the handbook of operant behavior and stuff like that. So long story short, I did always kind of approach some of these problems as what's the relevant stimuli going on here, both from the the contextual standpoint in terms of what's going on ahead, before problem behaviors were occurring, what are the relevant, outcomes that could be reinforcing problem behaviors and things like that. And this is, I will, what was interesting is that I didn't have a course in applied behavior analysis as a graduate student. And I think if you listen to the Jim Carr interview, he talks about how that kind of ABA program at Auburn kind of grew up over time. And certainly things have changed, and the field is, preparing people way differently and way better, I think, in many respects. But yeah, it was definitely different. But I felt like I had a lot to learn about the actual nature of the disabilities, the nature of the challenging behaviors and things like that. There was a little bit of learning curve. I think the first day on the job at Aberystwyth, some guy charged me with a chair, running at me with a big chair, so so learning to deal with that, learning to, help people change and help people clean up after toileting accidents and things like that. That stuff was all new, but
Of course, all part of the job.
It's arduous. It's work. It's not technically difficult, so.
Right. And I love that you ask that question to the guests that come onto your show. It's so great to hear everybody else's perspective of how their career developed, in their own words. So I'm not sure if I have it 100% correct, but I believe I read Skinner's intro into behavior analysis, and this might have been from when I was reading a special edition of Walden 2, or one of his disciples, they called one of his books. But it was, I believe, Skinner started off as an English major in undergrad, and he went through and he worked and he wanted to be a writer, and he graduated and he tried writing, he tried getting into it, but nothing ever took off there. So he realized he had to find something else to get into, and he came across psychology. And that's when he, entered into experimental analysis behavior and discovered operant conditioning, and everything grew from there.
Wow.
But even when he was in his graduate program, it's interesting how when I was reading a little bit of background about it, he was using behavior analytic principles to get him through it. He knew that he was going to be behind all these already psychology majors that have been doing it for many years. So what he said is he almost in a way arranged his environment, and he would wake up really early in the morning so that he could read before work. He'd go to work, and then he would, read again after work. So he had a consistent schedule that, he manipulated. So that's definitely one of personally my favorite parts of the shows when you have all the guests on.
Thanks. It always generates an interesting story. So and it's just people I meet personally, come to behavior analysis from such different circumstances. So it's fun to kind of get that backstory, especially with people who are relatively well known in the field.
Great. And while we're on the topic, let's get into some questions about the Behavioral Observations podcast.
All right, let's do it.
All right. And now I actually just caught up with episode 31. I'm gravy because Celia said it was so great. I had to hop on because usually I hoard the last 2 or 3 episodes just so I have something to listen to.
Oh, man.
But yeah, so when did you start recording and getting ready to put the whole thing together? What can you tell us? This is your great work.
You mean when did I decide to do it and stuff like that, or how?
What prompted you to get started, and then when did you actually start the whole process from the beginning?
Oh boy! All right. I don't think I can put a specific. I could probably put a specific date on the first interview I actually recorded, but the planning time went way beyond that. It was sometime back in 2014.
Oh, wow.
I think. I had known I wanted to do something.
What?
I unlocked it from here.
So this is the live part of the show we were talking about.
I knew I wanted to do something from a dissemination standpoint. I felt like I had been in the field for some bit of time, and I think that point of time, it probably was like 15 plus years or so. And I had something that I wasn't sure what I was going to do or what I was going to say. I thought I would probably write a blog or something like that. At the same time, I was driving around, and of course, so many of us drive around so much in our cars. We spend so much time on the road. I kind of discovered what podcasts were. I didn't know really that they existed. And when I first discovered podcasts, I was like, oh, cool. I can listen to stuff about the Patriots. I can listen to stuff about, my, other type of niche, interests and things like that. And eventually I kind of was driving around and like, oh, there's got to be something on behavior analysis. And so I'm going through iTunes. I'm looking. There's a couple of things here and there. And I don't want to say I was the first ever behavior analytic podcast, because I know like Rick Cabina had like the Precision Teaching podcast. I think Java put out a couple of episodes, and there were others. But there wasn't a podcast that I felt like there wasn't a podcast that was like other podcasts I was listening to that I liked, So, I like the idea of long form interviews that are relatively unstructured or semi-structured. And so there certainly wasn't that. I think the podcasts that were out there that were mainly things like, people talking about a particular topic, talking about studies and things like that. And nothing wrong with those. Those are informative. And I think, to put an asterisk on that, the folks at the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science had a podcast called I think Act in Context. DJ Moran had a podcast where he had a couple of interviews too. So there were some folks in the ACT community doing stuff like that, but nothing necessarily in, kind of more mainstream behavior analysis, particularly applied behavior analysis. So I started thinking, wow, maybe I should, well, first I thought, like I said, I was going to do some blogging and stuff like that. Then I realized that writing a blog and doing a really quality job with that is really, really hard. And it's probably something I wasn't going to be all that great at unless I spent a ridiculous amount of time. I could kind of see myself spending time on doing stuff like this, having conversations and whatnot. So I started to kind of hatch the idea of the podcast. I tried to kind of model after some podcasts in different genres that I liked. And so that's kind of where it developed. That kind of took several months to develop that, to get from that point A to point B, to be honest. And then then I kind of started, once I started kind of committing to it, and I had the site behavioral observations for a while, probably going back to 2013 or 2014. And if you scroll all the way back, if you go to behavioralobservations.com and go all the way back to the beginning, there are some posts that are more blog-like. So, for example, I went to Mass ABA, and I want to say 2014 or 2015, and I had kind of like reflections from Mass ABA and things like that. Excuse me. But after that, once I started to kind of make that transition and really commit to doing a podcast, I started ordering microphones. I started getting the right kind of software to record and things like that. And I want to say probably in August of 2015, I recorded my first interview, and it was with DJ Moran. I felt DJ would probably be someone that would be receptive to it because he had a podcast himself and kind of understood the deal. And he was very, very gracious in coming on the show and helping to kind of break me in as an interviewer.
Yes. But what I remember is that wasn't the first one you released.
That's true. That's true. So what I did is, and this is common when you, it's fun. This is so like meta, but like I listened to a bunch of podcasts about making podcasts, believe it or not. I know it sounds super dorky, but I did it. And I'm glad I did because I think it was helpful. But, the idea is that you want to have some number of shows in the can, if you will, for a couple of reasons. One, when you launch a show, you want to launch with, a couple of episodes. And two, you want to also make sure that if something happens that ties you up, say work gets crazy, you have a family issue or something like that, you have something to put out there.
Right.
And so I also wanted to kind of curate the first couple of episodes for maximum impact as well. And so I think I interviewed, the first couple of interviews were DJ. I interviewed John Bailey. I interviewed Jim Johnson. I interviewed my good friend Steve Lawyer from Auburn, and then Greg Hanley. And of those, I felt Greg would probably be obviously John Bailey and Jim Johnson, huge names in the field, of course, but the way Greg talked about functional analysis, I knew that was he was a popular speaker because he's such an engaging personality when he's talking, and he talks with such enthusiasm. And the way our recording came out, I thought it was just really, really good stuff. I wanted to lead with that one.
Right.
And so I thought that was of the, and then I had, I think episode 2 was my buddy Steve, not a household name. And then I had John Bailey, so one of the things I try to avoid I like the fact that I have people in the kind of lineup that you may not have heard of before. Because oftentimes they come on and they surprise people with very interesting things, and they're not on the keynoting circuit. So most of the time you're not going to hear what those people have to say. So I kind of sandwich Steve in between, two kind of heavyweights, if you will. I kind of pay less attention to that as I've gone on and as the show has become more, popular, if you will, because people are kind of, I think the people who dig it have already bought in. They're and so.
Of course. Speaking of that, how many listeners do you have? Is another question we have.
I can tell you actually in almost real time here.
Okay.
So it's hard. Well, let me rephrase that. In podcasting, it's really difficult to figure out how many actual listeners you have. The kind of coin of the realm in podcasting is download numbers. And so from total number of downloads for all 31 episodes that have been released right now are at 305,000.
Oh, wow.
305, believe it or not. So
that's great. That's between all 31 episodes going to all the people out there.
Yeah. So, we passed a 250,000 episodes or 250,000 downloads of last week. It was just mind-blowing.
That would be a lot of episodes.
A lot of episodes. That's all. Yeah. And it still blows my mind that people take their time to, download a podcast, my show and listen to it. It's crazy.
And it's so great to see that our field is expanding at such a rate that, there's that many podcast or that many episodes that have been downloaded at this point. It shows, like you're saying, that people are interested and that we're growing enough that we have good information out there for people to want to listen to.
Yeah. And I think too, one of the things that really made me, pivot to the podcast as opposed to the blog was the idea that, okay, I have kind of for lack of a better term, a captive audience. Because again, we spend so much time driving around in our damn cars, and I feel like I could be of service, giving someone, to those who are inclined to listen to that, giving them something interesting to listen to, hopefully interesting to listen to. So it's crazy. And now there's other podcasts like ABA Inside Track. They just released a killer interview today with Bill Ahern. I heard it. I listened to it on the way to work today. It was great. Those guys are doing good work. Becca Marie's podcast, The Business of Behavior, the why we do what we do, Ryan O'Donnell's podcast. So there's a lot of good stuff out there, and I'm really glad that other people are kind of doing that, and not just with podcasting, but also just in media in general. The stuff that Todd Ward is doing at bside21.org. And of course, folks who've been doing this, these types of dissemination efforts for a long time, like Amanda Kelly and others. So it's a lot of fun things happening. So
of course. And I'm going to tie a couple questions I have here together. So you're interviewing some top players in the game in our field. Do you ever get nervous before reaching out to them, while talking to them live? Is it hard to contact them? Do you feel like they're willing to get their voice out there and record something?
Let's see. I'll tackle those questions in the reverse order because it's easier that way. Build up some momentum for the last one. I have been blown away with how generous people have been with their time. So to answer the question, for the most part, no. People don't. They're not elusive. They're not aloof. It's been quite the opposite. I think the biggest barrier is just people's time and schedules. Everyone's busy, especially some of these people who are flying around the world doing, talks and things like that. I think it's more of a scheduling thing than anything else. Like, for example, I was going to interview. This happened actually a couple times. I'd send an email out to someone. They'd send a really nice email back, and they say, and let's say it's okay. So it's August right now. I was like, well, can you call? Can we do something in December? So it's not that it's not a no, but it's a later.
Right.
So that's happened a couple of times, but that's unusual. Most of the time we're able, to work something out. So I found people, like I said, just extraordinarily gracious with their time, especially for, I don't know. When you really come down to it, it takes them it takes not only the interview time, but the correspondence to get it set up. I'll send them, basically a bullet list of ideas of things that we could possibly talk about. So I'm sure many of them review that. So it's a commitment on their part. So, I'm really, I genuinely appreciate that they're doing this, so do I get nervous? I don't anymore. Sometimes I'll get a little bit like when I feel like I'm going to fumble the first line, when I say, hey, Roger, welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How you doing today? I sometimes worry that I'm going to mess that line up. But usually by that point, by the time I hit record, it's kind of like what you and I did earlier when you, Celia, and I were just chatting. That usually kind of takes care of things. So that helps to kind of quell whatever nerves that may.
Can we call that pairing?
I'm sorry?
Can we call that pairing?
Yeah, possibly. Yeah. It's just one of those things that, you get whatever, you're having small talk prior to the interview. And I find that extraordinarily helpful in terms of generating rapport as well as, eliminating any type of nervousness.
Nice. Well, since we got to hear Celia's voice there, this is a good time to ask another one of her questions. And she said, I find myself increasingly servicing learners that have executive function and mental disorders such as OCD, ODD, anxiety, and it's so exciting to use the science to help these learners. Can you share your experiences and knowledge on ACT and the work you're doing with non-ASD populations?
I will. Yeah. So I here's what I'll say about this. When I'm talking about ACT, you guys are coming along for the ride with me as a learner. And it's a topic I love to talk about. And it's really exciting to see the potential of this technology. Right. Having said that, I am not an ACT therapist, so I try to be very clear with that. I will and also my role is that of a school consultant. My real job is that of a school consultant, and very often I don't have the contact time to go through Mark Dixon's ACT for Children with Autism and Emotional Challenges curriculum one-on-one with a child. That's just unfortunately, I can't do that. I don't have the time to do that. So it's usually me kind of encouraging others to learn about it, encouraging others to kind of, at the very least, buy that curriculum and consider doing some of those, exercises. And even to the extent to which kind of picking out certain exercises for people to do, knowing that some of those ones are going to come across as super new agey, if you will, and which might be a barrier for someone to kind of dip their toe into and try it. So I find myself more of a cheerleader of it, and so I don't use ACT as much as I wish I could. There have been some school guidance counselors that I've worked with who have gotten the curriculum. We have discussions about it and things like that, and they're kind of off to the races, and they're starting to use it. I'm really excited to hear about how some of these studies that Mark is doing comes out, so that I'll have a little bit more, ammunition, if you will, in terms of trying to persuade people to use it.
Of course.
Not that data is always that useful in persuading people in schools, but more is better than less, and so there's that, right? When I'm working with kids with emotional behavioral disorders, and we'll just use that as kind of a wastebasket term or a catch-all term for ODD, ADHD, etc. Really what I'm trying to do, and if it's a kiddo in a what we would call, and I'm using air quotes here for the listeners who can't see, kind of a typical classroom or a regular education classroom. Most of my work is with the teachers, and believe, when it really, at the end of the day, it really comes down to, okay, what is the function? What's the reinforcer for the problem behavior? What are some skills we can teach that replace it? It's not all that different than the interventions we do for kiddos with developmental disabilities. How we do it might be a little different. We might use a little bit more language. There might be a little bit more flexibility in, say, teaching, replacement mans and things along those lines. So it's really that sort of thing. I think that I use. If I was, I'm noticing in the comments here, someone's writing in and said they work exclusively with youngsters with emotional behavioral disorders, and they ask, what reading materials should they be reading? Again, I would try to get your hands on Mark Dixon's curriculum and start using that. What I try to encourage teachers to do, and I wish more of them would take me up on this, would actually be to incorporate that into their like morning circle, so you can do some of those exercises, whether it's a mindfulness exercise or a values clarification exercise or something like that. Some of those are really amenable to that. Or if there's, for older kiddos, if there's an advisory that happens on a daily basis, to use it as part of that. Those exercises only take like 10 minutes or so.
Of course.
That would be one thing. But I think a lot of our basic behavioral skills, I don't want people to kind of run off half-cocked and practice outside of their scope. Certainly, don't get me wrong, but we are equipped with a repertoire of skills to look at the context in which these challenging behaviors occur, and put together some effective interventions.
Well, speaking of that, that's great. So we have a lot of pre-2B and new BCBA individuals in the group.
Okay.
So we like to ask questions and bring things up around that area. And a question for you is, did you have a strong or close mentor that helped you develop your skills when you first started?
Absolutely. I had many. And so this gives me an opportunity to kind of give some shout outs. Certainly, Tony Nevin and Randy Grace at UNH, I spent more time with Randy. He was exceedingly kind and really gave me a lot of opportunity, just like I said earlier, to be up close to the actual science that was going on. Certainly, Jim Johnson was my major professor, but even some of the other folks there at Auburn who were really helpful to me, guys like I said, Tom Critchfield, Chris Newland, people like that. Other graduate students that were senior to me were also, really, really helpful to me.
So what made them great mentors for you personally?
Oh gosh.
I remember a strong mentor to me when I was working on my supervision hours. It was great because she gave me the flexibility, Samantha Florentino. She gave me the flexibility to do all the research on my own in the background. And I spent hours and hours and hours researching. And when I had questions, she was always available. I could walk right into her office or, interrupt her at any time. And she would sit down with me and she would explain to me what, the problem I had at the time was and how to approach it. Mm-hmm. And then otherwise, she'd be fine with letting me go out there and she would lead me in the right direction. And, let me figure out some things on my own. I did have another one that was another supervisor that wasn't amenable to the way I would work personally. And at that point is when I realized that I needed somebody to almost bounce ideas off of and, the way that helps me the best.
Yeah. Well, I think certainly having that ability to talk with someone who not only can talk in the same vocabulary and conceptualize problems in a similar way, but also someone who has some more trials under their belt, if you will, right? More reps, if you will. And so I think anyone who's been doing something, and of course, I don't want to equate age length of service, if you will, or length of time in the field. That it's not a one-to-one correlation with quality, certainly. But certainly seeing things happen, seeing how things play out, being able to draw on that experience is certainly, helpful. And the extent to which any of the mentors have communicated that to me, certainly where things were unclear and whatnot, for example, when I worked at the Institute for Professional Practice, my boss, Dr. Leanne Millender, she was great. She was really good at kind of letting me kind of do my own thing, but also being there, as you were saying, to kind of, bounce ideas off of, but very, very, very sharp and certainly had a lot of insight when I did need to do some problem solving and things like that. One of the cool things about that organization too is that we had this kind of peer review committee as well. So that was just kind of baked into how the organization ran. So when there's, individual with a, kind of a repertoire of problem behaviors and we couldn't really make progress or whatever, that's what that meeting was for. Because chances are there are other people struggling with other, cases. And so we would basically present cases and get feedback on it and things like that from folks, like Leanne or, other folks there and stuff like that. And so that was, those types of situations are helpful. So anyone out there who is, kind of in charge of any type of clinical activity, that can kind of arrange those circumstances, I think that would be beneficial to those who are, in the beginning stages of their career.
Great. And so then in that case, at this time, or have you at any point been a mentor to anybody else?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, mainly through the process of supervision. I don't do a lot of supervision right now. And I just kind of got back into it actually after being away from it for a while. And so I'm excited to try to function in that role again. But yeah, I've had folks I've supervised, I've worked very closely with, but even, it's like special ed teachers who aren't behavior analysts, working with them very closely. It's been fun to kind of, it's probably one of the more fun aspects of the job is really helping people not just solve a particular problem in a particular context, but to build skills that they can apply to novel circumstances without direct guidance.
Sure. And I'm going to ask this question now,
Sure.
just because we might have a couple more that might take a little bit longer. Would you give any advice, or what advice would you give to any new and upcoming PCBAs?
I knew this question was coming. I don't think it's I have a couple of different answers, but I think I'll stick with this one. It's not necessarily all that clinical in nature. It's more about managing your lifestyle. I know that sounds kind of out there, but what I would say is that, if I was younger and getting into the field and things like that, it takes obviously so much work to prepare for the exam, to go through your coursework and do your practicum and all that stuff. You get into the field, you get your first job, you're probably working a lot of hours, especially these days where it's, kind of all about the billable hours and so forth. So there's a lot of work with that. Life comes at you pretty fast, and a lot of things happen pretty quickly, and I've I don't want to say I'm old as the hills, I'm going to turn 43 here in a few days. But if I look back, I felt like my 30s went by like that, I first started working as a behavior analyst, right out of graduate school. So I was 24. And so, so between like 30 and 35, a lot of life experiences happened to me. I had a parent pass away. I had 3 children, or I didn't have them, of course, but, I wasn't, anyway, and, I had transitioned in and out of, a job. I started my own practice. And so I feel like that whole decade went by in a blur. And one of the things I think, I don't like to say, I don't like to list regrets or anything like that. And I also don't spend a lot of time thinking about this sort of thing, but I know for some amount of that time, I just had my head down working. And I didn't probably take as much time as I should have to say, like, to go to conferences and things like that. And I certainly, I obviously did the hours to maintain my certification. Excuse me, but I wasn't out there. I think just looking back, I could have contacted the literature more effectively. I could have networked more effectively, and things like that. And also, I think that there's a lot of pressures on you to really juggle your work life and your personal life, and that kind of gets back to what I was talking about from a lifestyle perspective. How do you adequately, do that dance when you have all these competing contingencies going on? So, I guess, long story long here, I would recommend that new entrants to the field really think about, be very mindful about that sort of thing, especially as things get crazy. How do they, and to have some sort of plan of action, because life does get crazy. Weird things happen. Sometimes unfortunate things happen. And how are you going to deal with that?
Sure. Well, you're obviously a very busy person. You're doing this podcast, so that takes contact time, takes live time, recording. You have your own practice. You got kids. You're very busy. Do you use any self-management interventions yourself to help you stay on track, whether systematically or in situ, lists, monitoring data, traps, environment, adjusting the environment, MOs, reinforcers? I'm
going to hopefully not disappoint anyone, but I use none of those. From an organizational perspective, I'm a hot mess.
One day at a time.
Yeah, so and one could say I started this podcast to avoid doing things like, other sorts of things that I should be doing instead, like, keeping more organized and things along those lines. So I'm sorry I disappoint anyone who thought I had something worthwhile to say on that.
Matt, we thought you figured it all out.
No. That's why I have guests on the show, right?
All right. That makes more sense then.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to jump into a question from Karen Murphy.
All right.
He, as in you, Matt, said you used Hanley's ISCA on a client when interviewing Hanley. Could you ask him if he implemented a treatment plan following this and how that went? So asking you.
Sure. Yeah, I've used it. I've used it a bunch of times. I will say this. I think the analysis piece goes very quickly, and that's the easiest part. And if Greg was here, it's the same thing. I'm sure he would say the same thing. It's the treatment that's really tricky. I think the biggest barrier to that protocol is having someone skilled enough to do that really precise shaping up of those repertoires, fading out of the prompts, the whole 9 yards. And I, again, as a consultant, that's the biggest challenge I have in terms of trying to use that whole process. I have gotten kids through that process, not necessarily generalized to the point that I'm happy with, and certainly that those are things we want to continue working on. But clearly, it's one of those things that it's you have the glimpse of the promise of it, because it's like, gosh, if there was someone with some level of those kind of really tough to learn teaching skills, we could be further along by now. I will say this. One of the things that's surprising, though, is with some kiddos, once they learn the omnibus man, in other words, once they can meet their needs, colloquially speaking, sometimes the problem behavior just kind of, I don't want to say goes away, but what happens, I've seen this happen a couple of times, doesn't happen every time, but in other words, once the kid realizes, hey, if I ask for what I want, and I get it, subsequent demands or transitions or whatever's aren't all that bad. I'm guessing what the private, events are or whatever, or so I'm trying to, those are guesses. I don't know if that's actually what's going on or not. But
so are you saying you feel like once the learner has an appropriate way to manned, then that almost solves most of the problems there?
I've seen it in a couple of cases. They've gotten what they want. Let's say it's escape the tangibles or something like that. Once the kid knows, so in these couple of cases, once the kid figures out, hey, if I get what I want, if I ask for what I want, sometimes I get it. So it's not that big a deal to do this other stuff that this person's asking me to do, to make this transition, to put down this toy and go do this other thing that I don't like or whatever. I've seen that happen a couple of times. So it's pretty cool.
And do you think it would be the same for access to attention?
Yeah, probably not. Depending on, it depends. I really couldn't speculate on that,
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. Sometimes when I was working with middle school children as well, I was almost getting the same impression where once the problem was solved, we were able to move on and worry about the next schedule, the next part of the day. Mm-hmm. So I'm actually glad you mentioned that there.
Yeah, and again, it's happened a couple of times. Obviously, a small percentage of the time, and I really wish I understood what was going on conceptually better. But we're practitioners, right? So it's like, hey, we'll take it.
Getting the job done.
Yeah. So
that's great. All right. I know I don't want to keep you too late and we're getting closer to the end. So
I'm available as long as you need me. So
You don't want to tell us that, Matt. This is how I think we'll finish the end. I have a few more questions, and then maybe I'll open up some live questions for the last couple minutes, if you're okay with that.
that'd be awesome.
Great. So anybody that is joining us today, if you have any live questions, have those ready. And I'm going to ask you a couple more now.
All right, let's do it.
Let's see if you're willing to give away some information here, Matt. You ready?
Okay.
Are you willing to tell us about any upcoming guests on the show? Sneak peek here to the ABA study group.
Well, you guys all came here, so let's see. I am doing a promo episode featuring all the speakers for the 3rd annual New Hampshire ABA conference, which will be coming up for those of you in this area on September 30th in Bedford, New Hampshire. So
that's great.
I thought I'd do something a little different. So to promote the event, I am doing brief interviews with all the speakers. So we have Greg Hanley is giving the keynote. So we did a very short interview the other day, or tried to do a short interview that took long. That was longer just because of probably the history of being on the podcast and things like that. So Greg's going to do the keynote. There is let's see who else. Oh, Derek Reed, another podcast alum. He's going to be doing a little brief kind of trailer, if you will. And that's kind of what these are. These are kind of like movie trailers for their talks.
Yeah, Derek Reed focuses on more OBM.
Behavioral economics.
Behavioral economics. Okay, great.
Yeah,
Great.
he's going to be talking about behavioral economics and how to apply behavioral economic principles to very common social problems. And let's see, we've got Mark Sundberg.
Oh.
Yeah, so we got some pretty big names. We've got Caitlin Kirkwood, who's one of Kathleen Piazza's graduate students. She's going to be talking about the latest stuff as it relates to feeding disorders.
Yeah, and then you said Greg Hanley earlier, and I didn't even budge. I didn't say anything because he's already been on the show 3 times.
That's right. I was chatting with the other day. I said, you're like the Alec Baldwin to Saturday Night Live.
Unlimited episodes.
Unlimited availability. No, remind me to say something about that in a second. Let's see who else. We have a guy named Mike Miklos, who is from the Pennsylvania Autism Assistance Program, the PATN, and he's going to be talking about their program, and they're doing a lot of neat statewide interventions for kids on the spectrum. It sounds really cool.
Wow. If I can't make it into, I didn't get a ticket because I wasn't aware of it, but if I can't make it into that conference, rest assured I will sneak in somehow.
Crash the gate. Yeah. So yeah, that is September 30th. And if you go to nhaba.net, and look under events, all the details will be there. So you can check it out there. But just to circle back to saying about Greg, one of the funny things is that his shows are by far the most downloaded shows.
Really?
Yeah, it's crazy. Like one of his shows has been downloaded almost 30,000 times.
Oh wow!
The last one he was on, the Q&A episode was session 20. And
I think
I listened to that Q&A maybe at least 4 times. And every time I listen to it, I find eureka moments, and I find that I have something that I need to investigate further, and it just leads me into different directions. And I met Greg at ABAI, not this year, but last year, and he's so down to earth.
Oh, totally.
And you know what, Celia, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I've also listened to him a couple times, the episodes, and it's clicked with me, and I really wanted to keep my opinions, out of anything live here, or recorded rather. But if we can't do FAs, then it makes sense to try to do what we can with our individuals in their natural environment, so that we have the best information that we can to move forward as fast as we can. And that's as much as I'll say on that.
He's fantastic. So I'm always happy to have him on the show. And so, but if those in the New England area, yeah, come check it out live and in person on September 30th. So
great. If anybody has any questions that they want to ask Matt, just click the raise hand button. I'll find you. Yes, you can even raise your hand online now, and you can ask it live. Meanwhile, while I'm waiting for that, what episode has given you the most aha moments? That one's from Celia as well.
Oh, that's a good question. I think Pat Fryman's first episode, when he was talking about behavior analysts dealing with everyday problems. Yeah, and it kind of goes back to the advice to new BCBAs that I was saying earlier. When he said, behavior analysts, get depressed. Behavior analysts have anxiety or can, experience anxiety. Behavior analysts have trouble sometimes with their marriages or children, whatever. And it really, I don't know. That was it's such a simple concept, but it was so profound, it was like, wow, and again, it's one of those things where, getting back to what I was saying earlier, I don't want to belabor that point, but so many things happen to you so fast in such a short period of time. Not that I say my experiences are like everyone else's, but things can get really stressful really fast, especially in this line of work.
Okay, that was where that hot mic interruption occurred, and if you want to hear the actual blooper reel itself, stick it out to the end. But while I had to break the tape here, I thought I'd just remind you that if you're looking for Type 2 continuing education, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/getCEs, and you can see what we have to offer. We've got things on ACT, trainings on behavioral economics, functional analysis, and functional communication strategies, and ethics. So now back to our interview.
Can you
I've
mute,
seen this
can you
app.
mute that? Thank you.
I've seen this meme rather. That's what does it say? I don't get mad anymore. I know too much psychology. Where the meme should actually say, I don't get mad anymore. I studied behavior analysis.
That's funny.
Oh man. But yeah, and I don't see any hands raised here. I think we got some nervous people today. So I'm going to ask.
There's one question by one of the members earlier posted, Mandana. She talked about, I'm just looking at the chat here. She wanted to talk about stimulus control. Let's see if I can find her question. She raised her question a little bit earlier. Mandana, if you can hear us, if you can just unmute yourself and just ask your question.
Yeah, I was wondering if we can get some information about, if I have the time to talk about stimulus control, and what are the easiest way to get the concept. I don't know. What are your, or the those antecedents stimulus that we can use them as behavior change techniques. So those the concepts is confusing a little bit for me. I'm reading Cooper, so
I see. My advice would be to attend the ABA study group hangouts.
And we actually, I think I recently did that chapter not too long ago. Yeah, and that is a great question. So yeah, why don't you contact us afterwards as well, unless Matt, you want to say something, so we can get you into some Zoom sessions where you can study and learn live with us at other points too.
Yeah, I'm tempted to throw out an answer,
Go for it.
but
Cool.
I at the end of the day, I'm not really, I would probably just look at the, before looking at stimulus control, I think it's important to kind of kind of master that grid of, positive, negative reinforcement, and positive, negative punishment, and really think through different examples of those. And sometimes that can really, that kind of informs how you see the larger contingency, whether it's a contingency that is for skill building, or a contingency that you're looking at in terms of trying to solve some problem as it relates to behavior reduction and things like that. But getting really solid on that, and also thinking about some of the things in which ways in which those elements can be applied to everyday human life. And again, and this is not a flip answer like my previous one was, but looking at some of the things that you guys post, you guys are always posting really cool questions, like so and so went to the car wash and this happened. This is an example of this, that, or the other thing, and so
you can thank Celia for a lot of those questions.
Yeah, so really trying to look at everyday events through a behavior analytic lens, I think more generally will help you with that sort of thing. So
nice.
It's probably not as specific as answers you're looking for, and I apologize, but hopefully these guys can hook you up with something more technically sound.
Of course, Manda, feel free to send me a message after. I'd love to Zoom with you after and break down the concepts.
Okay, thank you. I have another question. Is there is any way you can tell us if in future, if I want to work with adult with anxiety or any behavioral problem and using ABA technique, who would be who are the people are doing research, or is anybody doing this as far as, because I really like to do that as far as my master in educational psychology. I came to ABA field to be more practical, using ABA strategies to help people have not just autism, or developmental disability, but people are struggling with anxiety or not other behavioral problems. I really like to get more, information and experience regarding that. Who would I contact, or what were your suggestions?
Let's see. I think the idea of reaching out to people and figuring out how to learn more about this stuff is key. One of the things we don't want to do, and it's always tricky, right? Because so many of our practices are overlap with other disciplines, whether it's special education, speech therapy, or whatever. One of the things that's really important is to not practice outside of your scope. And if someone has an anxiety disorder, yes, those are responses, and yes, of course, those responses are fair game, if you will, if you look at the dimensions of behavior analysis, of course. But I think the idea would be to get some sort of training, and whether that's. And so what I would probably do is probably try to do some lit reviews and see who's, doing the recent work in these types of fields. One area that you might look at is the ACT website. It's contextualscience.org. And so within that, and if you join the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, you have available to you all sorts of protocols and trainings and PowerPoints and videos and all sorts of things like that. So, and there's also a directory of practitioners trained in ACT. And so that would maybe do a couple things for you. One, it would provide you contact with some of the ACT literature on these topics. It would provide you access to, as I was saying earlier, all sorts of presentations, videos, PowerPoints, etc. And it also provides you opportunities to reach out to people, perhaps who are in your area, with whom you could get some supervision or at least some guidance. And so I think that would be my best piece of advice. Would go to www.contextualscience.org, and then kind of take it from there.
Awesome. Matt, thanks a lot for that. We appreciate it. Any advice to anyone in our group, we really appreciate. And this has been great.
Absolutely. It's been a lot of fun.
Wow. It's nice to put you on the spot for once. I think we learned a lot today, a lot about what you do, a lot about what's going on in the field. I'm certainly excited to sneak into the conference up in New Hampshire, which it looks like in the comments, some other people are already buying tickets. So you made them aware as well. Thanks for that.
Right on.
And yeah, let me play you out. And hopefully we get to have you again soon.
All right, guys. Thanks so much. This has been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Matt. Awesome. All right.
Alrighty, folks. Big shout out to Celia Heyman and Roger Matar for organizing this Zoom hangout, and it was great to take questions from the ABA study group community as well. Again, if you head over to Facebook and plug in ABA study group into the search bar, feel free to join that, and they've got all sorts of things there. The Zoom meetings being one of them, the study questions and other sorts of things like that. It'll help keep you sharp. It'll help you prepare for the test if that's the stage of development you're in, and so on and so forth. So lots of good stuff. And I appreciate everyone who attended the Zoom meeting as well and submitted questions and things along those lines. I also want to probably apologize to some folks, especially the part of the interview where Roger was asking about mentors. I am now quite certain that I've omitted many people. It's kind of like one of those awards shows, where someone's listing off all the people that helped them get, achieve some objective or win some award or whatever, and someone's always going to be left out. So to the many mentors and influential people, I apologize, and I'm not going to repeat the potential error of trying to create a secondary list of folks. I'm just going to say that there are, certainly folks who are very very important in my professional development, and so anytime you're trying to put on create some sort of list like that, at least from my perspective, it's easy to kind of reflect later on. It's like, oh, I should have mentioned so and so. But anywho, and one other thing before we get to the blooper, if you have a chance to leave an iTunes review, I would be very appreciative of that. And so if you go to iTunes and search Behavioral Observations and leave a rating and review with some constructive feedback or whatever, that would be awesome. I'd really appreciate that. It helps kind of get the word out. We've got, I think on the US iTunes store, there are 62 reviews currently. And when you compare that to the now almost 350,000 downloads that have occurred, it's just kind of funny. So the podcast is getting out there, I think. And so if we can get some reviews going, that would, at least try to get somewhat commensurate with the download numbers. That would be super cool. So I think that's pretty much it. I'm going to play this little cut, and remember that, if you got little ones in the car, probably not the thing to play in front of them. And I hope you get as much of a kick out of it as I did. And until then, we'll see you in session 34. Thanks a lot.
Oh, shut up. How do you watch this shit?
I think someone's watching TV. All
right.
So, Matt, now that you say that, that reminds me.
Live, everybody.
So I think I will listen to this every time I feel that I'm getting too big for my britches. It'll be a nice grounding exercise. So anyway, goodbye again. See you in the next session of the Behavioral Observations Podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.